the cloud. And I wonder if it's recording the right information because it's recording to the cloud. And is it recording this one? Or is it recording the other one? Confusing. Okay. Now, yesterday we already talked about this many other Elliott 8.6 feature, right? And so that's a part one. Today, this is a part two. And the first thing I want to talk about is we have a big improvement in handling email in Elliott 8.6. And in Elliott 8.5, we have a default Elliott email server, and then we have alternative email server. And then the default mail server is that you will basically, you say I'm using a default, right? And then now that default email server has a user ID and then the password to authenticate it. Now, that generally speaking can work if you host your own email server. But let's say you use another third party to host your email server. In this case, for example, my company, we use Microsoft. They host our email server, okay? And then we are using something called, somebody called it Office 365, or somebody called it Outlook 365. But the real technical term we use is called Exchange Online. So essentially, Microsoft, okay, hosts the Exchange server for us. And so we don't need to have an in-house Exchange server. By doing that, we actually have a lot of benefit because we don't need to have an email infrastructure. And there's a lot of burden associated with it. And then you need to deal with a spamming issue. You need to deal with all the hardware, and then electricity. You also need to, there's a lot of burden associated with it, okay, hosting your own email server. So by making Microsoft hosting the email server, I only paying $4 a month for user, okay? So it's dirt cheap in my opinion, okay? And but here's the restriction come with the what I call the Outlook 365 or Exchange Online is they watch for their reputation, right? They don't want you to do spam. And one of the way they consider that you may spam is that you authenticate yourself as ABC, but you are sending your email as XYZ. They say, ooh, this is a sign of spamming, okay? And then they will block it. And then so in our default Elliott configuration, you can set up and say, okay, what is your authentication email? Like in my company, right? I set it up, I said, okay, so the default is emk@netsolent.com. And my password is blah, blah, blah. And then that worked well for me and will send an email. But when Roger is trying to send an email, and he said, I am ISS@netsolent.com, and he authenticated as EMK@netsolent.com with Microsoft. Microsoft say, no, okay, you are not going to do that. And because they consider this is a potential spamming. And then so, well, there's a way to get around that in the Microsoft Exchange, but it's, takes step tedious to handle it, okay? And so, but the default behavior is they don't want you to basically send on behalf of other people. And then because of the spamming issue, right? So that made the default email server capability now working out well. So then basically, if you have an outside, hosting provider, then chances are you were using the alternative method, okay? So this is So this is basically what I'm going to show you that in Elliott 8.5, if you want to make it work for Outlook 365, this is what you have to do. You have to say in your setup, okay, you have to say, my email address is this, and then my authentication email is this, and then they have to match. Because if it does not match, then they basically say, oh, you are trying to using one email address to do the relaying, and then they don't want to do relay, and then because of the spamming concern, okay? And then so in this sense, okay, so if you're hosting outside, you really only have a one email server option. You don't really have two email server. So that's a restriction with 8.5. So now what we do in 8.6, we said we need to maybe expand this ability, because I think the idea actually first come from Aaron, okay? You mentioned that you want to be able to use Exchange Online, but you also want to use SendGrid, right? Are you still using SendGrid? Okay, so and so we don't really have a good option for you to allow to use both of them at the same time. And then until we come to the Elliott 8.6, right? So the Elliott 8.6 right now, okay, will handle like this. Because what will happen is first, let me talk about the idea about what is a registry, okay? So the all the setting earlier you see, okay, in Elliott 8.5, it is saved in a local registry and then under a long path name, but eventually it was saved under the Elliott 8.0 configuration section. And what I highlight on the top left corner, that section is the register string associated with the email setting. Now then, because we need to support more email server now in 8.6, that particular setting is not really compatible with 8.6, okay? So we need to have a separate area to save those information. But I don't want you to set it up, okay, just because you upgrade from 8.5 to 8.6, right? So what will happen is when you start up Elliott 8.6 for the first time, if the user is starting up for the first time, we will copy your email setting from the 8.5 area to the 8.6 area. So we do a one-time copy. But once we do the one-time copy, that stay independent from each other. And so we pop up a message and then give you the warning. Your personal email 8.6, your Elliott 8.6 email setting have been established from your previous 8.x setting. Any change you make to 8.6 email setting will not apply to 8.5 or prior version, because from this point on, they are separate now, okay? Just to give you a message. So this is just information, okay? And basically, you don't need to do anything with it. So so in the Elliott 8.6, we allow up to 3 email server, and so the scenario will be Outlook 365 or Exchange Online. Obviously, they have good reputation. When I send email out, I never get any kind of a problem, okay, or get blocking, okay, things like that. And then another commonly used email server is called SendGrid. And SendGrid, because they allow you to do mass marketing, so their reputation is not as good. And then there are many other email providers will either, consider the email coming from the SendGrid is a potential junk, or they may even block it, okay? And then, but the situation is complicated, and then so it's not always that you will have a problem, but sometimes you have a problem. And then depending on who's your neighbor, okay? Because when you are using SendGrid, and then if it happened that the same guy that's sharing the same email server with you did a lot of spamming, and then people complain, and then suddenly that IP address got blacklisted. Okay, and then when they get blacklisted, when they blacklist the IP address because of your neighbor, you get blacklist too. So sometimes this kind of thing is like that with the SendGrid, okay? And then, but on the other hand, Outlook 365 never had any problem because Outlook 365 places restriction. So what will happen is in Outlook 365, when you send out an email, right? Okay. So first, they don't let you do the relay, right? That's the first thing, okay? And then the second thing is when you send out email, if you send too many of them, that will raise the red flag for them, okay? And then so, and then the Outlook rule they stated is that if you send more than 30 email in 1 minute, then they will start blocking you. Okay. Now, under the normal situation, nobody would do that, right? I mean, unless you're doing the mass email. Okay. And what should we do? Okay. Like in my situation, this conference, right? And then we have 40-some people email I need to send out. And so I do a mass email announcement, but I don't want Microsoft block me. So what do? I basically throttle it, make every email wait for 2 seconds. So I send out email, wait 2 seconds, send a second email, 2 seconds. So this way, I will never exceed 30 email. Okay. So I use Outlook to send out the email, taking a little bit longer, but that's okay. Now, but if you have tens of thousands of emails to send out, now waiting 2 seconds is not okay. So then in that situation, then you say, well, I have to work with somebody like a SendGrid, even though their reputation is not as good. I have to just take it, right? So with a small amount of a mass email, you can use Outlook 365. For mass amount of mass email, you need to use somebody like a SendGrid. So that's basically the current situation. So how do we deal with it? Okay, so in the 8.6, when you set up the email, so this is a new look. And the top one, there is still the default email server. The middle one, okay, and in this case, I use the Office 366, 365, which is basically Exchange Online, okay? And then the bottom one is SendGrid. So what I did is I said, okay, for my PDF post office, for any event processing email, and for any of my document email, which is like the order confirmation, order quote, shipping acknowledgement, those HTML email is considered document email. And then so for any of those, okay, and any other, which is because my radio button is at my second server, right? So that basically meaning this is my default server. My default server share everything by default will use the default server. In addition, PDF post office, event processing, and document email, we're using my Office 365. On the other hand, for SendGrid, it's not my default server. But if I do mass email, okay, and then use SendGrid. So I did a test, okay, like for 40 email, right? And then if I use Office 365, waiting 2 seconds, it's taking 1 minute something to finish, right? If I do through the SendGrid, okay, like this setting, I do a 40 email, it's like that, it's done, okay? And it's so fast. And so that's basically the trade-off we have to deal with, okay? And then in this 2 different environments. So right now, that's the reason we extend multiple server, and then we basically let you say, under what situation you want to use what server. We give you more choice. Does everyone follow this idea? Okay, so the next subject, DDF and Elliott 8.6. And DDF stands for Database Definition File. It's a schema for accessing our Elliott data and by the P-SQL engine. And in the DDFI contain table, column, index, and basically describe how our data is like and how to access those data. And our DDF basically reside in the, for Elliott 8.6. So it resides in the Elliott bin A6 folder. And under the bin A6 folder, we have a DDF 40 subfolder, okay? And under that folder, we still have more subfolder. And then so I will explain more, okay? So what happened is with this DDF, right? Since this is basically how our data is, like how to access it. Elliott need a DDF, okay? P-SQL need a DDF. Now, when Elliott started the Elliott, okay, the first thing we do is we will read from the DDF file, and then we will cache in the memory. And then from that point on, we don't need to open that DDF file anymore because we already cache inside our memory, right? But on the other hand, P-SQL doesn't do that. And so if you use our DDF to basically let the P-SQL, use a relational operation and then do things, and then what will happen is it will stay open of those DDF file, and then which is creating problem because if you try to update those DDF, it's very difficult. Okay, and also which is the subject I'm going to talk about. Okay, and so this is an example of a DDF used by Elliott, and then Elliott mostly use a transactional engine. So when Elliott using transactional engine, and then Elliott will read the DDF and then basically cache in the memory, and then from that point on, we don't open that DDF anymore, right? So now this is an example. So this is an example for Xender, because in Xender, and they have a customized version of DDF that has the item text percent and item, text spaces, which is related to the excess text. Okay, so that's a unique situation. Most of you guys don't need to deal with excess text, but they do. And then so we have this two custom field added for them. So since it's custom field, they need a custom DDF, and which we're going to talk about that, okay, down the road. And the DDF used by the P-SQL engine, this is the example, right? Again, as I said, when you are using P-SQL engine access the Elliott database, they need to open that DDF file, and then they need to open it constantly. That makes it difficult to update those DDF files. And so this is an example. Again, Brian, we are using your example, okay? And then so in the Elliott bin A6 DDF 40 folder, and then this is what you can expect to see. First, you would expect to see all the DDF in there. You also will see a folder called STD DDF. STD DDF, that stands for standard DDF, okay? And then in this case, we have another one called the Zen DDF. That's our convention for a customized DDF. So Zen, that stands for Xender, right? So Zen DDF contains Xender customized DDF, okay? So what is the difference between the DDF in the root directory versus the DDF in the standard DDF directory? There's no difference. So why do we need two copies, right? So now this is basically what happened. When we are installing Elliott 8.5, okay, by default, we don't update your DDF. Now, because updating DDF is problematic. If somebody using the DDF and then like a P-SQL using the DDF, and then our installation processing will just fail because the DDF is open. So in 8.5, we don't basically touch this subject. And then so, well, it's not, we don't touch this subject. In 8.5 installation utility, if you want to install the DDF, you have to use the custom installation option. The standard installation, skip the DDF, right? The first time installation, you will install it, but the update will not update the latest DDF unless you specifically choose to do it. Now, on the other hand, DDF is very important for 8.6 because right now we start to use the relational engine for the report desk and then power search, etc. So our DDF has to get updated. So what do? The strategy, but we also want to make sure that when we do the installation and then we update the DDF, right? So then we have to come up with a method. So in Elliott 8.6, when we install, the DDF by default will be updated. And by 8.5 by default, it will not be updated. So the things you need to know is this, okay? In Elliott 8.6, when we install the DDF, we install into the DDF 4.0 folder, okay? But there's another folder called the standard DDF, right? Underneath that, that's also a DDF. Those are the DDF that we use to create the P-SQL database engine. So the DDF in the STD DDF folder, those will be open, okay? And by P-SQL engine, so let me go back to this screen, okay? The DDF in the STD DDF, those DDF, we use it to create the database to be used by P-SQL. The DDF in the root directory, that's used by Elliott. And then remember Elliott, when we start out, we read it, we cache it, and then we close it. So those DDF doesn't stay open, right? So what happened in Elliott 8.6 by default? These DDF will get updated, okay, by default. And we don't expect a conflict. But the STD DDF, we don't update it because if you are using the P-SQL engine, we expect there will be a conflict, so we don't update that DDF. Then we need to have a method, okay, to deal with it. So the method we deal with it is after, okay, you install the update. And if you log in as a supervisor, and supervisor user will compare the DDF 4.0 folders with the STD DDF. Are they different? If they are different, we will attempt to do the update. If they are the same, or we do nothing, right? So we basically will handle that by the supervisor. And but at that time, if the P-SQL engine is still actively using the DDF file, then when the supervisor log in, we won't be able to update. The supervisor will get a message. Okay, so this is basically an example of the message. So Alicia, this is basically the type of message you are seeing. Remember with Outlook, right? I'm sorry, Outdoor. Okay, so when you log into the supervisor, you get this annoying message and say, we cannot do the update. Because why? Because the DDF is opened by your website. That's the reason. And then, but you said, okay, and then what do I do, right? And then to get a DDF update. Then the way you can do that is by shutting down the website, which is not a good thing, okay? And but so well, there's another way is that you can shut down the P-SQL engine and then stop and start, okay? And then that will basically clear out the connection, and then you can try again, okay? And but those are drastic, okay? And then so so also we talk about various different things as far as how do you update the DDF, type of thing, okay? So the story is 8.6 DDF is more critical for us to update it. So by default, we install the DDF, okay? And then, but the DDF we install into the DDF 4.0, chances are there's no conflict, okay? And those are for using for Elliott. But the DDF used by the P-SQL engine, we will only update it when you log in as a supervisor. and then and then we will try to update it. If it doesn't update, we just give you a warning, and you can continue to do your thing. Okay, that's the idea behind that, right? So our assumption is we just basically assume that if you can log in as an Elliott supervisor, then you must have enough admin right, meaning the NTFS security right. You can update the DDF40 standard folder directory. That's the assumption. And also supervisor should know what they're doing, right? So then so when the supervisor logging, they see this DDF message. So then if they have enough information, then they will say, oh, okay, maybe I pick a wrong time to log in as a supervisor. And then so maybe at the end of the day, and when nobody is using the system, then they can log in supervisor again and then get the DDF update. So that's really a strategy, okay, right now, with how do we handle the DDF. So we actually even wrote a knowledge base article about this, and they say, okay, when you log in as a supervisor, okay, after your DDF is Elliott 8.6 is installation update, and maybe you get this message, and then what do you do, right? And then so according to that document, basically what you can do is you can, let me see. So according to the documentation is that if you're trying to update it and then even during the evening you still cannot update it, all else fail, then basically we just say, okay, time to stop and start the P-SQL engine, okay, to get an update. And then, well, but that's really very drastic, right? And it's is there any way we can avoid that? Okay, so yeah, actually, there's a way to avoid that, and the way to avoid that is using in P-SQL there's something called a continuous operation, okay, and then you can put a file, okay, into the continuous operation mode, and then by using the BU tier and --BU, BU stand for backup, okay? So you said, I want to back up this file. So make sure that nobody is open this file. That's basically what it's saying, okay? Closing all open. So then now you can copy this file, you can update this file, do whatever you want, okay? And then, and what the P-SQL engine do is when you do that, it actually, for example, like the first line, right? So start BU on the attrib.ddf file, right? So what it does is it will create a file called attrib. And it will do a _01, okay? It's basically what I call a net change file. So they're basically saying that P-SQL said, okay, I understand. You want to have, you want to make sure you can access this file, okay, update this file, etc. But I need to save any kind of, potential change to this file in between to this Delta file. And then so now what will happen is after you do a start BU, and then you need to come with an end BU. You say, I'm done. And then so when you do an end BU, it will roll your Delta file back to the DDF file. Does everybody understand the mechanism behind it? Okay. So you can do this, okay, to make sure that the file can be back up. And then well, it's kind of tedious to do this, okay? And I actually create a BAT file in the DDF40 folder. If you have to update the DDF, and then you can just copy this. The only thing that you have to remember is the path I'm saying here, right? It's a local path. You cannot use a network path. It doesn't use a relative path as well. So so you have to specify the local path. And then because everybody's local path is different. So this batch file I'm providing is only a sample, may not work for you. You need to modify my sample file to match your local path to make this work. So the processing is you want to copy the DDF. So you do a stop EU, which is the batch file. That put all this DDF file into the continuous operation mode. Now you can copy it, update it. Once you update it, you do a MBU, and then the MBU roll back the Delta file back to the original DDF file, and then you all set. Your DDF get updated. There's only one small downside associated with this, is all your DDF file now, in this case, get updated to the current system day and time. Okay, so if I ask you, say, hey, what is the date of your DDF, right? Because we want to know the version of your DDF. And then you tell me, oh, my day is today, okay? And then, October 13th, etc. Well, we didn't really make a release on October 13th on DDF. And then so from that point on, we don't know what version of the DDF you're running. That day is simply reflecting the date. You did a stop EU and an MBU. Okay, so that's the downside on the date, okay, of the DDF. Now, so this is basically the issue associated with so Brian, you complained that in your export processor, your custom DDF is gone, right? Well, that's because when Elliott started, Elliott will always read the DDF from our Bin86 DDF40 folder, right? Remember our update installation will override it, right? So that DDF is always the latest standard DDF, okay? But where is your custom DDF? Your custom DDF is in the Zen DDF subfolder, right? So how can we make the utility, how can we make Elliott, including the export processor, recognize the DDF for Xender is actually in that Zen DDF DDF folder? That's basically the issue. Don't go to the standard path, go to a custom path to get the startup DDF. So the way to do that is, well, actually we have a knowledge base article about this as well. And then but as it find out is you need to go to the ELA60.cfg file. You need to add this entry, okay? And then once this entry is added, it will know that your DDF is actually pointing to a special path. And then from that point on, you start up your Elliott, and then you will find out that, oh, your item text percent and your item text basis come back now. And then because it's in the Zen DDF folder, it won't be overwritten by the installation utility. That's basically the whole thing, okay? What is it? Because this happened to you. So I find that it's important to talk about this, okay? But in a sense that this will also apply to Davidson because you guys have a custom DDF as well, right? Libc is the same thing. You guys all have a custom DDF, okay? Now, so this is basically talk about what I have just said is when you're installing LE 8.5 or 8.6 during the day, okay? And if you run Elliott from the network, then no, you cannot install during the daytime. So George, I think you remember that we talked about running Elliott, right? You can run Elliott from the network folder, but our recommendation is you run Elliott from the local folder, okay? And then so, because if you're running from the Elliott from the local folder, then you can do installation during the day. But if you're running from the network, because those files are open, then you will not be able to do the installation during the day. But even if you're running Elliott from the local folder, right? And For 8.5, it's usually not an issue. But install 8.6 during the day, maybe it depends, okay? And then sometime, we may need to update. Remember in the 8.6, right now we put some file in the root directory, right? Like for example, all your report desk, power search, all those files is in the root folder. And then if those files get changed, and which can happen from time to time, and then your user is using report desk and power search, etc. And then when we do the update, and then we may have a conflict. So whether we can do the Elliott 8.6 during the day or not, that depends. Okay. If the installation doesn't update those files, then that's okay. But if the installation update those files, then there may be a conflict. And so then in Elliott 8.6, maybe a safer strategy is to do the installation in the evening, and then when there's no user around. Okay, and this is similar to when we talk about a DDF update, right? And then again, as I said, if you have a root directory BTR file update conflict, and because somebody is using it, and you can use a StarBU and an MBU method to get around with it, okay? So these are the example of all the report desk and a power search file in the root directory. And those files now in 8.6 installation, okay, it may or may not causing conflict. Yes, go ahead. Right. 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 Okay. So you're talking about this, right? So this is basically in the Bing A6 folder. There's a DDR40, right? And then so which one should you point into, right? You should point into this standard DDF. In 8.6, that's what you should point into. Okay. And then I will actually show you another utility, okay, which is in my Elliott and in my Bing A6 folder, we have a utility called ELA60DB. You see this file? ELA60DB. DB stands for database, okay? So if you click on it, and it will say, okay, it recognized that you already created a database for the data in the data 14, but you have not created a database for data 95 yet and data 96. So what it can do is you can say, you know what, okay, I only want to create a data 95, okay? And I go and say, create database. Now it is created, okay? Now, you don't have to manually create it yourself, okay? You can just let the system do it for you. And now, where is this pointing to? It is pointing to the Bing A6 DDR40 STD DDR folder. Okay, now, but let's say you didn't create this, right? You could do this also, okay? You could also do this. You can also do this from the P-SQL as well. But it's more effort, okay, and then more knowledge. Now, did you see? This is the 95 we just created, right? Now, if you go do a right click on this and then go to property, and then if you go to directory, you will see that this is the folder, right? And then, but it's pointing to the data 95. Remember earlier, we didn't create data 96, right? So if I want to create manually right now, what do? I right click on this database, I say new, I create a database, and then my database name will be Eli A6 data 96. And where's my location? I specify my DDF location, okay? Now this particular utility provided by the P-SQL, it's not ideal, okay, because the step is a little bit complicated because it doesn't let me specify the data, right? It just assumes the location is for both my data and DDF, but that's not true, okay? And so there's some shortage, okay, with this utility. And then, so when you do this, okay, first the name, right? This is our naming convention, okay? It starts with ELI, and it starts with a version, which is A6, right? Then it's starting with what data folder you're talking about. So data 96, okay, is the data folder. So this can be Eli A6 data, Eli A6 data 02, 03, etc. That's basically our convention. We suggest you to follow this convention. And then because then in other places, when we trying to locate the database, we will follow this convention as well. If you create your own convention, then yeah, there's some issue, okay? So follow our convention, and also when you do this, this should be unchecked, okay? And then I said finish. Okay, so I create an Elliott A6, Elliott data 96, right? Except I cannot use it yet. Because what happened is if you right click and go to property, and you find out that, oh, it's assuming that the DDF where I store it and then the data is in the same folder. That's not true, right? So I have to remove it. I have to do a new. I have to basically get that back. And I have to say it is data 96. Okay. And then now I apply. Okay. So now the data 96 is usable. That's a lot more difficult than the things I just showed you. Okay. Okay. All right. So this issue we're going to talk about is the DAT file in the data folder and there's still some DAT file in the Elliott data folder. The DAT file, these are the example, okay? And then you see the example like, you see this one like apctlfil.dat, right? That stands for accounts payable control file. And basically your AP setup like a next voucher number, all your AP default information is saved in that DAT file. And the next one is called AR log transaction file. That's a log file, okay? Let's not talk about that. Allocation file, that's a log file too. And then the next one is ARCTLFIL. That is your account receivable control file. Your AR setup like your next invoice number, and then many other AR setup is in there. The next one, BN control file, bill of material control file. That's your next work order number, okay, etc. So these are DAT file, okay? This DAT file, okay, is actually costing problem for us, okay? And that's the reason why in Elliott 8.6, we try to get rid of it. But we cannot just get rid of it, okay? And then so I'm talking about what is the role, okay? And so I'm going to talk about the BTR and the DAT. BTR are those database file handling by PSQL. DAT file, we handle ourselves. We handle it through the operating system, okay? And then so we are not using any database engine to handle the DAT file. And then so because the BTR file is handled by the PSQL engine, right? So the PSQL engine sitting on the server and running as an admin. And then PSQL server can access the BTR file, even if the user does not have the right to that BTR file. So you don't really need to grant user any right to the BTR file, and in order for the PSQL to access that file. So with the BTR data structure, we can revoke user right to the BTR file. So as a result, that for better security, and then the most likely scenario is to protect it against a ransomware, right? Because if the user has a full right to the BTR file, then what happens is under the ransomware attack, the ransomware can encrypt the BTR file. Then you are in big trouble, okay? And then so BTR file is, it's just basically, we basically need all data file in BTR file, but we still have some legacy file, which is a DAT file, okay? And then the DAT file is handled by the operating system. And then we basically tell the operating system to say, hey, we need to get this data. Operating system will get the data back for us, and then so in a sense, you can think about the DAT file as just like a TXT file. So when Elliott accesses the DAT file, is accessing the TXT file. And then in order for that to happen, the user need to have NTFS security to a DAT file, because otherwise when we access it, operating system says, oh no, you don't have a right to that, right? You reject it, okay? And then so what is happening is this, okay? Is in the current environment, okay? In the current environment, and because Elliott user need to have the right to access the DAT file, so we cannot really protect the DAT file through the NTFS, okay? And then so what happened is under the ransomware attack, ransomware may be not able to attack any BTR file, but they can attack the DAT file. So you are not 100% protected, okay? As long as we have a DAT file around. And then so, but it's not bad, okay? Because generally speaking, the DAT file is only the setup information that usually you can just copy back from your backup, something like that. And those setup information usually don't change, okay? The only issue is the counter, okay? So, I'm just basically, some information I'm sharing with you, like not too long ago, San Bernardino County Police Department, they are hacked. They need to pay $1.1 million to the ransomware. Now, if you think about it, right, police department, they are a law enforcement agency, and then they pay ransom. Isn't that a little bit ironic? Okay. Well, I think they probably have no choice, because I think they have maybe some data, because all this criminal, all this, laws stuff data, if they lose it, that will be really bad, right? I mean, so maybe they have no choice but to pay. And then, but this is also saying something, right? It's probably whoever in charge of the San Bernardino County IT, right? They didn't do a good job with the backup, probably. Okay, that's another thing. Okay, but I think backup is a big problem for many organizations. Okay, and so And then so in 2001, during the pandemic, okay, Colonial Pipeline was attacked, and they were forced to pay 75 Bitcoin, and that was 4.4 million at that time. And then so, but this is also real because my customer get attacked. Okay, I'm just being honest with you. Okay, and then so this is a real problem, and then so what happened is this. Okay, if you implement NTFS security, okay, I know many of you did it, but many of you have not done it. Okay, if you have not implemented NTFS security in your company with Elliott, then you are vulnerable. Okay, at this moment, if you did implement the NTFS security, your only vulnerability is to a DAT file. And then in that case, if you did get attacked, okay, and then, yeah, that's fine. Restore those DAT file back, right? But first you have to find out what is the workstation get attacked and then isolate it. And then restore the DAT file back. The only thing that you'll be missing is the counter. The next order number, the next invoice number, the next voucher number, etc. And then we have a knowledge base article and then telling you how do you figure out those counter yourself, and then you can update it. Okay. Yes. IN is actually BTR. That one is actually not the issue. Yeah. Right. Okay. So here's the thing. Okay, is it's all about data conversion, right? Okay. Remember in the our current database, okay, all the way from version 7.x to 8.x is all the same data, right? You can run version side by side, right? If I make 8.6 go through data conversion, and then I make the DAT file as a BTR file, can you still run Elliott 8.5 side by side with 8.6? You can't. So it's all about backward compatibility. You know, do you find me so well? Oh, right. So actually, what is happening is this. Okay, is in 8.6, right? You have the option to convert those DAT file to BTR. Okay, so 8.6 you can run either DAT or BTR, but you are not going to do that if you run 8.5 and 8.6 side by side. And then once you convert the DAT file to BTR file, you can no longer go back to 8.5. So that's a limitation. Do you guys follow? So first, get yourself to 8.6. And then once you're in 8.6 and running smoothly, you said, okay, I will never go back to 8.5 again, right? Convert the DAT to BTR, then you are fully protected. That's the idea behind that, okay? So and convert DAT file to BTR file is actually has another benefit is because I have a customer once in a while they have a duplicate invoice problem, okay? And Cheryl the other day told me about a scenario she has, and then they have a 30 packing workstation. They're packing workstation pre-invoices. So then she found out one day they actually have a scenario that they have duplicate invoice. And she looked into, she found out that 2 packing workstations was putting invoice at exactly the same time. And then that causing duplicate. And then because it is using a DAT file, the DAT file information of that 2 workstation, they all get the same next invoice number, okay? Because the DAT file is handling by the operating system always have some kind of a caching delay type of things, etc. So this kind of scenario can happen. But this is if we were using the BTR file, then we were enforcing the database locking, and then make sure that only one user can access the next invoice number in an orderly way. So if the AR control file is a BTR file, then I would say you will not get a duplicate invoice number. Okay. So basically the scenario, Cheryl, for you is once all your user converted to the BTR file and no more DAT, and then of course that's depending on when you start using 8.5, right? So once you start all user using 8.5 and then you can convert the DAT to BTR, then I'm pretty sure that the duplicate invoice number will not happen. Okay, but this has only happened one time though. Okay, it's not happened very often. They have that too. Okay, so Anna, does that still happen to you? Duplicate invoice number? How often? Hmm. Okay, but how often does that happen? Oh, it doesn't happen anymore. Ah, okay. So again, as I advised, right? So convert to 8.6. Once everybody is 8.6, no more 8.5, convert the 85 to BTR. So that's another thing that it will resolve. In addition to the security aspect. Huh? Right, exactly. So this is basically in our uh, the release note, right? We talk about how to convert the DAT file to BTR file. Okay. So we said, what are you waiting for? Okay, of course, we know that you have to convert to 8.6, okay, in order to start to use the DATM to BTR. Okay, so let's break for lunch. Okay. And